Okay, so the topic today is about intelligence. First, what is it? So when we're talking about intelligence, we will see that this has been defined numerous ways in psychology throughout the course of the discipline. But essentially, intelligence involves several things, including the ability to profit from experience. So this is the ability to basically learn from your mistakes, to acquire knowledge, so to learn new things, to be able to think in an abstract way, to be able to act with purpose, and basically to adapt, to respond to changes in the environment. So our general definition of intelligence, you can see, encompasses multiple things. There is also what's called the G factor in intelligence, also referred to as the general ability. Okay, so that's where the G comes from, general. But this is basically the idea that many theorists have put forth, including Spearman, as your text mentions, that there is some foundational level of intelligence. This is the general intelligence that underlies many of the specific abilities that we have. So for example, we have some kind of baseline foundational level of intelligence, and then from that we have specific verbal abilities. We have specific mathematical abilities. But this G factor or general intelligence forms the basis or the foundation for all of these other specific kinds of abilities. So we'll talk first about the traditional approach to measuring intelligence. You'll also hear this called a psychometric approach. So this traditional approach to measuring intelligence basically looks at how can we quantify people's mental abilities, the way that they process information, and how can we specifically use intelligence tests to measure intelligence. Okay, so the use of intelligence tests falls under a psychometric or very traditional approach to intelligence. Okay, so where did these IQ tests or intelligence tests come from? So first, IQ stands for the intelligence quotient. So it's basically a numerical score that is supposed to indicate basically how intelligent you are, at least the way that these psychometric tests have defined intelligence. So when we're talking about IQ tests, they have basically defined intelligence as the kinds of abilities that make you a good student. So the kinds of things that relate to academic capabilities, things like how quickly you process information, your verbal abilities, your mathematical abilities. So those are the primary things that are assessed by intelligence tests. So where did these tests come from? How were they developed? So the person who really developed this concept of an IQ test or an intelligence test is a man by the name of Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet was commissioned by the French government in Paris to basically develop a test that would help to identify slow learners. So to identify kids in school who needed additional help, right? Kids who today we might qualify as kids who have some kind of learning disability. So that was the original purpose of this test. And Binet believed that we should measure what he called a child's mental age. So mental age is basically showcasing a child's intellectual development compared to other children who are that same chronological age. Okay, so chronological age is basically your age in years. So let's say that we have children whose chronological age is 7. So for a child to be basically on par, that child should be able to do the things that a typical 7-year-old child can do. So things like reading at a very basic level, basic math, things like that. If the child is not functioning at that level, we would say the child's mental age is below 7. So it would be possible, for example, to have a child who perhaps has an intellectual disability. We used to call that mental retardation. Now we call it intellectual disability. It's possible to have a child then who is 7 years chronological age, but functioning at, say, a mental age of 4. Okay, so that mental age is about development relative to other children. Okay, so when we're looking at intelligence tests, we want our tests to be good tests, right? So three different qualities that we're looking for. We want tests to be standardized. So standardized, you guys are probably familiar with taking standardized tests in school. This is basically ensuring that everyone who takes this test gets the same kinds of conditions, the same kinds of instructions, so that we can basically establish what's normal, what is the norm for performance within a particular group. We're also concerned with reliability. So we want results to be relatively consistent over time. So if you take an intelligence test when you are 8 years old, we should get relatively comparable results if you take the same test when you are 9 years old. So that's reliability. Additionally, we're also concerned with validity. So validity answers the question, does this test measure what we think it's measuring? So if we define intelligence in terms of the kinds of behaviors or the kinds of abilities that make you a good student, then we want to make sure that our test reflects that. So we want to make sure that we are asking questions that tap into verbal ability, mathematical ability, processing speed. If that is how we have defined intelligence, we want to make sure that our test questions reflect that. So that's the idea of validity. With this psychometric approach, remember this is the use of IQ tests to measure intelligence. We find that IQ scores are distributed within a population using what we call a normal distribution. So that is this bell-shaped curve that is over here. This is called the normal distribution. So essentially, from this bell-shaped curve, we can glean a number of pieces of information. So first is that 100 is the average or the mean IQ score within a population. So 100 is the most common IQ score. So that means that the farther away that we get from 100, statistically speaking, the less likely it is that we are going to find people in our population who have that IQ score. Okay, so you can see that most of the area under the curve falls between 85 and 115. So roughly speaking, about 68% of people are going to have IQ scores in this range. That's a lot, right? That's a pretty substantial portion of our population. Again, as we move further away from 100, as we go down to 70, as we go down to 55, we see there are fewer and fewer people who fall in this range. Okay, so very few people will have an IQ score of 70, even fewer an IQ score of 55. And it goes the opposite way as well. So few people with a score of 130, very few people with a score of 145 or above. So statistically speaking then, the farther away that we get from 100, the less likely it is that we will find these IQ scores within a population. Population is basically a group of people. So our population could be college freshmen, and this normal curve here would explain the statistical likelihood of finding these IQ scores in that group. Okay, so one of the most commonly used intelligence tests based on the ideas of David Wexler. So the Wexler tests, they're available for preschool children, for children, and then also for adults. Most commonly used in the United States for measuring intelligence. Your book also talks about the Stanford Binet. That is another very commonly used intelligence test. But these are basically to give you an idea of the kinds of things that you might be asked to do if you are taking one of the Wexler intelligence tests. So here you might be asked to arrange these panels to make a coherent story. So first you have to plant, then you water, and then you harvest, right? Object assembly, put a jigsaw puzzle together. So how quickly can you do this? Digit symbol. So this is basically how quickly can you identify the numbers and put the correct symbol in the box down here. Picture completion, so filling in the blanks basically, and then block design, where you're shown a picture and then you use the blocks to recreate the picture. So all of these things then, we're looking basically at how quickly can you put these things together if we're measuring basically your processing speed as a facet of intelligence. Okay, so let's talk about culture and IQ tests. So IQ tests have been very much criticized because they are basically geared towards middle class, white, European descent individuals. So we often find that people who are not middle class white do not do as well on these traditional intelligence tests compared to the white middle class culture. There have been many efforts to try to make IQ tests culture free, but this is very difficult, right? Because culture affects so many things about these tests. So things like your attitudes towards assessment in general, the motivation that you have to actually perform the test, to actually try to do well on the test, if you even care about things like that, the relationship that you have with the person administering the test, how much emphasis is placed in your culture on competition. So when we talked about collective cultures and personality, not a lot of emphasis placed on competition with one another, so that might impact how well you do. And then also this idea of solving problems independently. So IQ tests require this, but not all cultures place a great deal of emphasis on that. So there are many studies that look basically at this idea of culture and at this idea of stereotypes and how that impacts how minority group members perform on IQ tests. So the basic idea here is this concept of something called stereotype threat, where people who are members of a minority group fear that if they perform poorly on a test, that will confirm negative stereotypes about their particular group. And this creates some kind of anxiety where the person actually performs worse on a particular test because of this negative stereotype about his or her group. So, for example, there is a stereotype that women are not good at math. So if I, as a woman, go into a math exam thinking, oh gosh, women aren't good at math, this is just really going to be hard for me, I'm not going to do very well on this, then that is going to negatively impact my performance. Stereotype threat affects groups like women, it affects the elderly, it affects members of minority groups. So these different expectations, right, kind of influence how people actually perform on these tests. Okay, so other ways of looking at intelligence. Okay, so one way to measure it is through those traditional IQ tests, but other theorists have disagreed with that as the only way to measure intelligence. So Robert Sternberg is one of those theorists, and he came up with what he called a triarchic theory of intelligence. So triarchic, there are three parts. So for Sternberg then, we first have analytical intelligence. So analytical intelligence, this is basically that you solve problems in a very kind of logical, systematic approach. This is the type of intelligence that correlates best with the intelligence that's measured by IQ tests. Okay, so analytical is basically the kind of intelligence that helps you do well in school. But that's just one way to look at intelligence. There's also creative intelligence. So with creative intelligence, people with this area of expertise are good at coming up with new solutions to problems. So if you're someone who, for example, is really good at creative writing, if you're someone who's good at things like poetry, maybe you're really good at things like marketing strategies, right? Kind of applying a creative approach to engage a new group of individuals. Creative intelligence is kind of where you shine. And the third type is practical intelligence. So with practical intelligence, this really focuses on solving problems of everyday life, everyday living. So you might know someone who's really, really good at fixing things, right? Like you, let's say your car breaks down, and this person can basically figure it out. That is practical intelligence. So from Sternberg's perspective then, people can have kind of varying degrees of these three different kinds of intelligences, but the creative and practical intelligence should be viewed as kind of complementary, that these are kind of other ways to look at intelligence beyond just that very narrow definition of analytical intelligence. Okay, so we can also talk about another way to think about intelligence, this idea of what's called emotional intelligence. So with emotional intelligence, people who have a high degree of this are skilled in several areas, from perceiving to understanding, managing, and then also using emotions. Benefits of emotional intelligence. There are many research benefits in this area. So we find that people who have high emotional intelligence are good at delaying gratification. So this means that they can inhibit an impulse in favor of some kind of long-term goal. And then it also correlates with things like being able to relate to other people on an emotional level, and success in career and social situations. So if you think about it, it makes sense, right? We like people who are good at kind of intuiting how we feel about something, and then they respond appropriately. So this emotional intelligence is basically going to make you kind of well liked or ingratiate you to other people. So that's another way of defining intelligence. Then we have Howard Gardner, and his theory of what he called multiple intelligences. So for Gardner, then, he looks at 8 different intelligences. You guys can look through these and see, but basically from Gardner's perspective, individual people kind of have fine-tuned abilities in these particular areas, and these 8 different intelligences kind of separate and help us understand, why people are skilled in one particular area versus another. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about motivation and intelligence. So we might think that, intelligence is the key. If a person is smart, then you will be successful in life. But we know that that is really not true. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about culture here. But really, when we're looking at how successful people are, it might be more about motivation than it is about overall IQ or intelligence. So, for example, if we look at grades and how they are related to motivation and self-discipline, we find that we can predict grade point average better if we know someone's degree of self-discipline compared to someone's degree of intelligence, right? So this idea that you have to be motivated. Maybe you know someone who you think is incredibly intelligent, a really, really smart person, but this person has no motivation. This person does not apply him or herself. But you might know someone who maybe is less intelligent, if we're looking at it from an IQ perspective, but this person works really, really hard, and that is going to be the key then to success. We also look at culture and how culture influences the kinds of beliefs that we have about intelligence. If we look at differences between Asian parents, specifically Japanese parents and teachers, and American parents and teachers, we find that Asian parents and teachers and students are more likely to buy into this idea that basically they have to work hard to be good at math. Okay, so it's not necessarily about some kind of innate, inborn ability to be good at math. It's about working hard. That's how you'll do well. Americans, on the other hand, look at math ability basically as something that you're born with, right? Like you're either good at math or you're not good at math. So as a consequence of that, American parents then, because of this belief, might push their children less to work hard in math. They might dismiss it as, well, you don't do well in math because you're just really not that good at it. Whereas a Japanese parent would say, you're not doing well in math because you're not trying, because you're not studying enough.